Hey there. I'm going to spend time today talking about two related topics for Nigeria. First is political economy, and second is the Niger Delta section of your current issues textbook section. I am not explicitly going to define or outline the resource curse for you in this lecture, but it is a concept that you definitely want to have in your head. So if you're not familiar with that already, take advantage of whatever resources are available to you. Think a little bit about the resource curse, and then come back to this video. I'm going to start with a framing that's pretty common in your textbook and in lots of other discussions of Nigeria's economy. And I'll add the caveat that I'm not necessarily endorsing this as like the best way of thinking about Nigeria's economy writ large. But this kind of dichotomous view is really common in the way that people, especially Westerners, talk about Nigeria in terms of economic development. So I think it's worth at least introducing you to. So the kind of standard, like two sides of the Nigerian economy story goes something like this. On the one hand, here's some good news about Nigeria. It is the largest economy in Africa. It is depending how you count, something like the 25th largest economy in the world if you measure just by gross domestic product. And it also has, depending whose count you're looking at, somewhere between the ninth and the 11th largest proven oil reserves in the world. So this should be a country that has a lot going for it. It has this big population with a growing middle class. It has a large economy, should be lots of power to influence economic, the direction of the global economy, just given its sheer size and also its access to this really valuable and widely sought after natural resource. But wait, there's more. On the flip side of this equation, Nigeria also has it ranks only 143rd, again, depending whose numbers you're looking at, on the world's GDP per capita rating. So its large population has to kind of divide those economic resources between themselves. 70% of its population lives on less than $3.20 per day. Something like 40% of them live below what the World Bank defines as the extreme poverty line, which is a little bit less than $2 per day. And so there's a really, really high poverty rate, basically, whoever's measurement you're looking at. And even though it produces huge amounts of crude oil, Nigeria is actually a net positive importer of gasoline. It doesn't have the refining capacity to actually turn its crude oil into something that you can use to make your car go without blowing it up. And so on net, it still has to import gasoline. And so this is kind of the common framing. Again, I don't think you actually have to think about Nigeria in this dichotomous way. I think the reality of basically any economy is a lot more complex than this. But if you want a guiding question to try and understand what we need to know about Nigeria's economy, that question might be, how is it possible for a country to simultaneously have such significant economic advantages in terms of sheer scale and natural resources, and also such significant challenges in terms of development and providing for the well-being of ordinary people? Let's back up and do, as I often like to do, because it is my job, a little bit of economic history for Nigeria. Under British colonial rule, the British in Nigeria, as they do elsewhere, particularly in Africa, emphasize the export of raw goods. They encourage Nigerians to cultivate on a commercial scale things like cocoa and palm oil and cotton, and to export those to the United Kingdom, and in turn to import their manufactured goods from the United Kingdom. So this is kind of a classic way of managing a colonial economy, emphasizing the export of these relatively low-value raw goods, and then using those colonies as a market for your growing industrial production. The British do leave, to some degree, an improved transportation network in order to get those raw goods from where they're produced to ports in Nigeria on the Atlantic coast. And so you do see the construction of a road and railroad network under British rule. Fast forward to World War II, which puts a lot of strain on the British Empire globally and particularly in Nigeria. The colonial government in Nigeria is going to impose a lot of restrictions on things like prices and wages and who gets a license to sell stuff abroad. And those restrictions are going to upset a variety of groups of people. One of those is workers. So you're going to see a number of strikes in Nigeria during World War II. Another of those is entrepreneurs. So people who think, actually, absent these colonial restrictions, I could be a lot better off and my business could do a lot better. And so that kind of tightening of of Britain's economic hold on Nigeria for what the British viewed as strategic necessities of fighting World War II ultimately made it harder for the British to hold on to control of Nigeria and increase nationalist sentiment, contributing to Nigeria's independence in 1960. One thing that the post independence government has going for it, despite what you know is the massive political instability in the decades after independence, is that they're exporting lots of oil, and the price of oil in the 1970s is going to rise. And so, growing revenues for Nigeria's military government is going to allow them to pursue a pretty aggressive policy of import substitution industrialization. I think you've probably heard this term before, but as a reminder, it means that in order to try and industrialize your country, to make it less dependent on imported manufactured goods from richer countries, you raise tariffs, you make it more expensive for your citizens to buy products that have been manufactured elsewhere, and then you give state support to factories that are manufacturing goods you consider to be important, or you just have the state establish, steel factories or car factories or whatever it is that you want to make, and run them directly. And the oil revenues are going to fund a lot of spending, some of which is quite wasteful in the 1970s. Similarly, you're also going to see Nigeria's bureaucracy grow in size. The government's just going to create a bunch of jobs. And those two developments are also going to create lots of opportunities for corruption. You know already that one of the kind of defining features of Nigerian politics is these really deeply enmeshed patronage networks where politicians give the resources of the state, including state jobs, to their supporters as a reward, as an enticement for continued loyalty and political support. And so as the state expands and as the state's role in the economy expands, the opportunities for public sector corruption are also going to expand. In the 1980s, fluctuations in the prices of oil and other commodities exported by Nigeria are going to drive the country into a debt crisis. And so it's going to have to do, as you might already remember from Mexico, it's going to have to do a 180 in terms of economic policies. It's going to implement a structural adjustment program under the advice of the World Bank, and implement a bunch of different policies of economic liberalization. So a number of those state-owned or partially state-owned enterprises will be privatized. Currency controls are going to be relaxed. Tariffs are going to be lowered. Free trade is going to be introduced or more widely embraced. And part of the effect of this program is to actually create the opportunity for even more corruption, because as the state starts to privatize its assets, politicians in charge of this process are going to give access to those assets, going to hand ownership of those assets over to their political supporters. We're going to see a similar process happen in Russia in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. So Nigeria, much like Mexico, and this is fairly common for developing countries around the world, has this kind of 180 from import substitution industrialization in the 60s and 70s to structural adjustment and economic liberalization in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. You can't really talk about Nigeria's economy without talking about oil, so I will do what I'm supposed to do and talk to you about oil. First thing you need to know, and I think you've heard this from me already, is that oil is mostly produced in the Niger Delta region. That's the oil-producing regions are highlighted in light blue on this map, and you can see that they are overwhelmingly concentrated in the south, along Nigeria's Atlantic coast. The Niger Delta, again, is where the river empties it. The Niger River empties out into the Atlantic. And so a relatively geographically small chunk of the country is producing the overwhelming majority of its oil. Oil's a really big deal in some aspects of the Nigerian economy, depending how you measure it. So about 90% of the foreign currency that comes into Nigeria comes in because of oil sales abroad. About 70% of the government's budget comes from oil. So the government's capacity to do what it wants to do, to invest money where it wants to invest, to spend money where it wants to spend money, is overwhelmingly dependent on its continued ability to sell oil. However, on the other hand, oil only accounts for about 9% of gross domestic product. So it's not true that the majority of Nigerians are employed in the oil producing sectors. It's not true that oil accounts for the majority of economic activity in Nigeria, but it does account for a really, really considerable share of the government's ability to generate and spend money. And of course, I should add a little asterisk to all of these figures, which is that since oil prices fluctuate, if you look up Nigerian economic figures in any given year, you might see significant changes in those percentages because the price of oil goes back and forth. So just a heads up that different years you'll find different numbers if you want to look at your own statistics for Nigeria's economy. Oil in Nigeria is nationalized. It is ultimately the property of the state, and it's controlled by an organization called the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, the NNPC. This is a state-owned oil company. However, the NNPC engages in extensive joint ventures with international corporations, with companies like Shell and BP, that are headquartered elsewhere in order to do the actual oil extraction. So a company like Shell will go into Nigeria and sign a contract with the NNPC, where they say something like Shell will own 40% of this venture, the NNPC will own 60%. But the effect of that is to give these multinational corporations considerable amounts of political influence in Nigeria, because the government is so deeply dependent on those foreign corporations coming in and paying these rents for resources, paying into these contracts to extract Nigeria's oil. And that's going to create some significant concerns about sovereignty and about political influence, perhaps a democratic deficit in Nigeria. Um, I said a moment ago that oil production is concentrated in a region called the Niger Delta, and so now I'm going to skip ahead to the current issues section of your textbook and talk a little bit about what oil production means for that specific region of Nigeria. So the Niger Delta, first, is extremely diverse. Nigeria as a whole is really diverse, but a lot of that diversity is concentrated in the Niger Delta. There's about 31 million people living in that region. Among those people are more than 40 different identifiable ethnic groups and more than 250 different languages and dialects. So this is an area where you have just tremendous, tremendous diversity with the possibility of leading to ethnic conflict. Oil production in the Niger Delta for decades has done significant environmental damage to the region. The drinking water is pretty contaminated. There are oil spills and leaks, which are very damaging to the environment. Some people actually will steal crude oil, and refine it essentially in their backyards. I have no idea how it's possible to do amateur oil refinement, but apparently this is something that's possible, and that generates a good deal of air pollution and also some safety risks. And it's also worth noting that as natural gas is extracted, sometimes it is flared or burned off, which is illegal but still pretty widely practiced. It's hugely wasteful, and it contributes in the long run to climate change as well. A lot of oil production in Nigeria, something like 25% of the production in the Niger Delta, is lost through a combination of theft. Illegally taking oil from the pipelines or elsewhere is a practice known as bunkering, for reasons that have never been clear to me. Sometimes there is politically motivated sabotage against oil infrastructure. And of course, there's a good deal of corruption, which means that the money generated through oil production often doesn't go to wherever it's supposed to go. And then one last consequence of this that's concentrated in the Niger Delta, even though the whole of Nigeria gets to benefit to some degree from oil revenues, is violence. And there's a couple of reasons why oil production has historically led to high levels of violence in the Niger Delta. One of those is that there's just a lot of money floating around, some of which is in government hands, and some of which actually comes directly from oil companies, who will sometimes make payments to local leaders, who basically is a thank you for tolerating their operation in their territory. And so there's a lot of competition, which sometimes overlaps with ethnic tensions in the region, for who's going to get access to oil money and for how local leaders are going to distribute those payments. Number two, starting after 1999, when Nigeria shifted back to the Fourth Republic and introduced electoral democracy again, the different political parties have gone into the Niger Delta and into other regions of the country and essentially lent their support to armed militias, who they use at election time to rig elections, to intimidate people who are going to vote for the other candidate. Those armed militias don't necessarily go to sleep in between elections, and so their presence and their weaponry is going to contribute to significant violence in the region as well. Finally, as I mentioned when I talked about society, and particularly civil society in Nigeria, there's been a number of groups in the Niger Delta over the last few decades that have emerged to try and resist oil production. Some of those, like MOSOP, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, use essentially peaceful means. Others of those, like MEND, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, and also a newer group called the Niger Delta Avengers, use armed means to resist oil production. And so they'll do things like attack oil infrastructure, sabotage pipelines, kidnap workers, foreign workers employed by the oil corporations, et cetera, et cetera. So the Niger Delta this isn't super widely appreciated, although actually I think it's recently been a plot point in an episode of Ted Lasso. The Niger Delta is an area where, these tensions over over the distribution of money, over the influence of foreign corporations, and over Nigeria's really complicated balance between a variety of different ethnic groups, can really come to a flashpoint. And it's definitely worth keeping an eye on as you follow news about Nigeria. I will leave it there. We'll have much more to say when I see you next about the resource curse as it applies in Nigeria, but I will stop there. Thanks.